Okay, let's jump right into this explainer, because we've got a seriously fascinating historical tension to unpack today. I want you to picture a 7th century society where literacy is practically non-existent. We are talking about historical estimates suggesting maybe 17 people in the entire city of Makkah could actually read and write. Just 17. Yet the very first verses of the Qur'an to be revealed didn't just ask people to listen, they explicitly commanded the prophet to read. And they highlighted the pen as the ultimate tool of divine teaching. So you have to ask yourself, how does a purely oral society process a command that is centered entirely around written text?
Welcome to today's explainer. We're going to put on our academic detective hats for this one. We'll be digging into a really rigorous investigation by Dr. S.A. Hamid Husseini, who tackles a massive historical question. Was the Quran intended to be merely an oral recitation, or was it meant to be a written book right from the very beginning? Now, just to be super clear right up front, we aren't here to endorse any specific theological viewpoint today. Instead, we're going to impartially map out Dr. Husseini's analysis of the textuality of the Quran and his critique of modern skepticism.
Here is our roadmap for the investigation. We'll cover 1. The meaning of iqra. 2. Orality as a necessity. 3. Refuting the ʿUthmān conspiracy. 4. Anachronism and research ethics. And finally, 5. The call to literacy. Let's dive right into section 1, the meaning of iqra. So, Dr. Husseini points out what he considers a massive philological error right at the heart of this whole debate. When you look at the root word of iqra, which is Qra, a lot of modern skeptics completely reduce its definition just to oral recitation. And they build their entire argument on this, right? They claim that because it just means recite, the act of writing was really just a secondary human invention that came decades later. But the study argues this is linguistically, well, totally incorrect. It's actually wild to think about how much historical weight is placed on the translation of literally just one 3-letter root. Because if you actually look at classical Arabic, that root carries multiple meanings that are deeply tied to physical written text. It means to collect or gather. It explicitly means to read from a written text, whether you're doing it silently or out loud. It means to study something with comprehension and to deliver writing into speech. So translating it merely as vocalizing from memory completely strips the word of its inherent connection to physical literature. And this connection to physical literature is brilliantly illustrated by how the source text actually views itself. Dr. Husseini notes that the Quran repeatedly categorizes itself right alongside existing definitively written scriptures like the Torah and the Gospel. Furthermore, skeptics of that era specifically demanded a physical kitab, a tangible book that they could hold in their hands and read. The concept of the text and the physical act of reading a book, they are completely inseparable here. Which brings us to section 2, orality as a necessity.
So how do we square this focus on books with the fact that basically nobody could read? Well, the author argues we have to separate the immediate reality of the situation from the ultimate goal. The reality was a highly oral pre-Islamic Arabia where literacy was virtually zero. Memorizing poetry and contracts wasn't some cool stylistic choice, it was a literal survival mechanism for preserving information. However, he asserts the ultimate goal of the revelation was a massive leap toward a written, urban civilization. Think about that for a second. It's an incredibly ambitious goal for a society with 17 readers. It's kind of like handing a bunch of people who have never even seen a wheel the blueprints to build a sports car.
But historical records cited in the study actually back this up. The Prophet actively employed scribes, known as kutab al-wahi. These verses were systematically dictated and written down on literally whatever was available. Parchment, leather, bone, palm leaves, you name it. On top of that, the text frequently uses the Arabic demonstrative hadha, meaning this. Now, you don't say this book unless you are pointing to a unitary, identifiable, physical entity that's right there in front of you. And that severely undercuts the myth that writing came much, much later. Let's move on to section 3, refuting the ʿUthmān conspiracy. Okay, so there is a highly popular modern skeptical claim that acts almost like a political thriller.
The theory goes like this. Decades after the Prophet, Caliph Uthman standardized the Qur'an and then destroyed all non-standard texts by the force of the sword, basically executing a massive cover-up to erase variant versions from history. I mean, it sounds compelling, right? Like something straight out of a Hollywood script. But the study asks a very simple question. Is this actually historical fact?
The study meticulously dismantles this conspiracy theory just by looking at the sheer logistics. Dr. Hosseini points out the massive lack of state apparatus in the 7th century. I mean, even modern totalitarian regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union totally failed to execute mass censorship, and they had secret police, modern bureaucracy, and mass surveillance. To assume Uthman could pull off a flawless cover-up across an empire stretching from Egypt to Central Asia on horseback is practically impossible. Plus, variant readings actually did survive. And, perhaps most tellingly, Ali ibn Abi Talib, a man absolutely renowned for his fierce defense of truth, became caliph right after Uthman and raised literally zero objections. If a massive cover-up had occurred, his silence would make absolutely no sense.
That logical flaw brings us perfectly to Section 4, Anachronism and Research Ethics. Dr. Hosseini identifies anachronism as the core fallacy haunting this entire field of study. Anachronism is simply projecting modern concepts onto the past. So, when skeptics imagine Uthman running a modern surveillance and censorship state, they are committing anachronism. Similarly, when traditionalists project rigid modern sectarian boundaries back onto the fluid, diverse 7th century Muslim community, they're doing the exact same thing. Good research absolutely requires evaluating the past within its actual historical constraints.
The explainer neutrally reports on a very specific example of this in the academic world, the legacy of the late Egyptian scholar Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. So Abu Zaid used discourse analysis, which is essentially studying how language functions in its specific social and cultural context, to study the Qur'an. However, this study points out that some followers later completely warped his framework to claim the physical book is merely a human construction, completely severed from divine origin. Interestingly enough, this is an extreme stance Abu Zaid himself seemingly abandoned, yet it continues to be weaponized today to reduce the text to a dead earthly artifact.
But here's the twist. Despite critiquing these skeptical frameworks, the author ethically concedes a really brilliant point. Modern skepticism is ultimately highly valuable. Why? Because it forces careful, evidence-based scholarship rather than just blind dogmatism. Criticisms should be honored because they push researchers to read the text more carefully. It forces believers and academics alike to rigorously defend their positions with hard historical facts rather than mere tradition. It keeps the scholarship sharp, you know?
And finally, Section 5, the call to literacy.
Dr. Hosseini points out a staggering statistic that brings this whole historical debate right out of the 7th century and into our modern living rooms. As of 2023, an estimated 754 million adults worldwide still lack basic literacy skills. Hundreds of millions of people are still deprived of reading and writing. When we look at that 7th century divine command to read and the elevation of the pen through the lens of this massive global deficit, that ancient push for a written civilization suddenly feels incredibly urgently relevant today. The elevation of humanity is, and always has been, deeply tied to literacy. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative final thought from the author's analysis. In an age totally dominated by social media algorithms, superficial skimming, and a genuine loss of deep reading, what is the state of human dignity? Has our vast modern knowledge actually made us more humble, or has it just made us more arrogant? The 1400-year-old command to read, to truly read, study, and reflect using the pen, is not just some historical curiosity. It remains a profoundly urgent call to elevate ourselves. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep reading and keep questioning.